The grand chandelier hanging from the ceiling cast a golden glow across the luxurious living room, its crystals reflecting tiny specks of light on the marble floors. Tundiamide sat on his plush leather sofa, scrolling mindlessly through his phone. He had just returned from a long day at work, yet his mind felt heavier than usual. He barely noticed the muffled voices coming from the kitchen at first, but when he caught the hushed urgency in their tone, his fingers froze on the screen. "She's too harsh," Blessing whispered. "I don't know how much longer I can take it." Another maid, Rose, replied in a low voice. "Chill. Don't let Olga hear you." Tun's grip on his phone tightened. He knew they were talking about Ada. Ada. His wife had always been the perfect woman in the eyes of the public. Charming, graceful, and poised like royalty. To the world, she was the devoted wife of Nigeria's most admired billionaire. But this was not the first time he had caught whispers among the staff about her behavior. He tried to dismiss it. After all, gossip among the household workers wasn't uncommon. Perhaps they had simply misunderstood Ada's firm nature. And yet, something about their voices unsettled him. Rising from his seat, he moved quietly toward the hallway leading to the kitchen. He wanted to hear more. As he approached, he caught another snippet of their conversation. "The old woman, she's the one suffering the most," Blessing said. "Madam treats her worse than the rest of us." Tun frowned. Old woman? His mind quickly scanned the faces of the workers in his home. He employed several maids, a cook, and a gardener, but none of them stood out as particularly old, except for one. Mama Beezy. She was one of the longest-serving maids in the house, yet she had always been quiet, keeping her head down and avoiding eye contact. Tund had barely paid her any attention before now. He should have walked away. He should have let it go. But something deep inside him told him not to. Because what he didn't know was that Mama Beezy was not just another servant. She was the one person in his life he had lost long ago. And the woman he called his wife was the very person who had made sure they never found each other again. Tun stood frozen in the dimly lit hallway, his mind racing. The whispers of the maids still lingered in his ears, each word like a sharp needle piercing his thoughts. The old woman, she's the one suffering the most. Madam treats her worse than the rest of us. A strange unease settled over him. He had always believed Ada to be a loving and graceful woman. He had spent years building a life with her, a life that the entire nation envied. But now, doubt had begun to creep into the perfect picture he had painted of her. Slowly, he turned away from the kitchen, walking back into the vast living room. The chandelier above him cast a soft glow over the space, but for the first time, his home felt cold. Soulless, like something dark lurked within its walls, hiding in plain sight. He sank onto the couch, staring blankly at the floor. Have I been blind all this time? Tund prided himself on being a sharp businessman, a man who could see through deception with ease. But had he missed something in his own home? That night, he decided to observe the first signs. The next morning, Tund sat at the breakfast table, sipping his coffee while Ada gracefully sliced a piece of fruit. She was dressed in a silk robe, her beauty effortlessly captivating. She smiled at him, a perfect, practiced smile. "Did you sleep well?" she asked sweetly. Tund studied her carefully. She looked as flawless as ever, her hair in perfect curls, her eyes filled with warmth. But was it real? "I did," he answered, masking the storm in his mind. "And you?" She chuckled softly. "I barely closed my eyes. Too many things to think about. The gala, the charity event, your business trip next week. You know how my mind never stops working." Tund nodded, but his attention shifted when he saw a maid approach the table to refill his glass of water. It was Mama Beezy. He watched as she walked slowly, her frail hands gripping the pitcher tightly. Ada turned to her, and in that moment, Tund saw it. The change was subtle but undeniable. The warmth in Ada's eyes vanished. The softness in her posture stiffened. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and her gaze turned sharp, like a blade slicing through the air. Mama Beezy's hands trembled slightly as she poured the water. "Careful," Ada said, her voice low and cold. Mama Beezy nodded quickly, lowering her gaze. Tund noticed the way her shoulders hunched, the way she moved with careful precision as if one wrong move would bring punishment. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, Ada's coldness vanished. She turned back to Tund with a dazzling smile, her voice light and pleasant. "So, tell me," she said, slicing into her fruit again. What time will you be home tonight? Tund barely heard her. His eyes were still on Mama Beezy as she stepped away from the table, walking slowly, disappearing into the kitchen like a shadow retreating into the dark. A strange feeling twisted in his chest. For the first time he saw it. Ada had two faces. Observing the monster. Over the next few days, Tund became more vigilant. He watched Ada closely, paying attention to the way she treated the staff. When he was in the room, she was the perfect madam of the house, polite, poised, effortlessly kind. She would smile at the maids, thank them for their work, even ask them about their families. But the moment she thought no one was looking, her mask slipped. One afternoon, Tund pretended to be working in his study while Ada moved around the house. He left the door slightly ajar, just enough to see into the hallway. A young maid, Blessing, accidentally bumped into Ada while carrying a tray of tea. The tray rattled, and a single droplet of tea spilled onto the floor. Tund saw it again. The shift. Ada's face darkened. "You stupid girl," she hissed, her voice sharp like broken glass. "Do you know how much this rug costs? If you can't even carry a simple tray, what use are you?" Blessing's eyes widened in fear. "I'm sorry, Ma. It won't happen again." "It better not," Ada snapped, "or you'll find yourself on the streets before the end of the day." Tund clenched his jaw. The moment Ada sensed movement nearby, she straightened, smoothing the non-existent wrinkles on her dress. She turned her head slightly, her expression returning to that of a graceful, understanding woman. She left the hallway as if nothing had happened. Tund sat in his study, his fists tightening. It wasn't just gossip. It wasn't just exaggeration from the staff. It was real. Ada was not the woman he thought she was. And the worst part? She had been hiding it right under his nose. The growing suspicion. That evening, as Tund lay beside Ada in their massive bed, he found himself unable to sleep. His mind replayed the events of the day, the whispers in the kitchen, the way Ada's expression had darkened, the fear in Blessing's eyes, and the trembling hands of Mama Beezy. He turned his head slightly, watching Ada as she slept peacefully beside him, her face calm, innocent. "Who are you?" For the first time since their marriage, he realized he didn't truly know the woman he had married. And if she had been capable of hiding this side of herself, what else had she been hiding? Tund swallowed hard. His mind kept returning to Mama Beezy. The way she avoided eye contact. The way she flinched slightly when Ada walked past her. The way she never spoke unless spoken to. Something was not right. And for the first time, Tund felt the urgent need to find out who Mama Beezy really was. Because if what he suspected was true, then he was about to uncover a truth far more devastating than he could have ever imagined. The next morning, Tund sat in his home office, but his mind was far from work. The weight of what he had witnessed the previous day pressed on him like a heavy stone. Ada's cruel treatment of the staff was no longer something he could dismiss as mere gossip. It was real, and at the center of it all was Mama Beezy. Something about the frail, silent woman unsettled him, not in fear, but in curiosity. She was different from the other maids. She was older, quieter, and held a sadness in her eyes that Tund couldn't ignore. He decided to watch her more closely, a silent observer. That afternoon, Tund sat in the garden, pretending to read, while keeping his eyes on the servants as they moved about their duties. He noticed how the younger maids were quick with their work, constantly looking over their shoulders as if afraid of being caught doing something wrong. But Mama Beezy moved differently. She was slow but deliberate, her wrinkled hands carefully wiping the table, arranging the flowers, sweeping the porch. She worked with the precision of someone who had been doing this for a long time. And yet, she never spoke unless spoken to. Something about her face felt familiar. Tund couldn't place it, but there was something about the way she carried herself, the quiet dignity she held despite her position, that gnawed at him. Why did he feel like he had seen her before? The first interaction. Later that evening, after Ada had left for a charity event, Tund found himself in the hallway near the kitchen. He saw Mama Beezy carrying a heavy tray filled with plates from the dining room. He stepped forward instinctively. "Let me help you with that." Mama Beezy froze. Her eyes widened slightly before she quickly lowered her gaze. "Ah, no, sir. I can manage." Tund ignored her protest and took the tray from her hands. "It's too heavy for you," he said. "You shouldn't be carrying all this alone." She looked up at him again, but only for a brief second before lowering her head. "Thank you, sir." Tund noticed something then, her eyes. For the first time, he saw them clearly. Dark brown, deep, but filled with something he couldn't quite describe. Pain, fear, recognition. A strange shiver ran down his spine. How long have you worked here? He asked casually as they walked toward the kitchen. Mama Beezy hesitated for a moment. Almost a year, sir. A year? Tun frowned. How come I don't remember hiring you? She smiled faintly. Madam hired me, sir. I was looking for work, and she was kind enough to take me in. Tun didn't miss the way her voice tightened slightly when she mentioned Ada. Something was off. As they reached the kitchen, Tun set the tray down on the counter and turned to look at her. Where are you from? Mama Beezy's hands tightened around the rag she was holding. A small village, sir. Outside the city. He could tell she was holding something back. You have children? He asked, watching her closely. She stiffened. For the first time, real emotion flickered across her face. Sadness. Regret. Loss. I did, she whispered. A long time ago. Tun felt his chest tighten. What happened? She looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face, as if debating whether to tell him. Then, she quickly lowered her gaze again. It was a long time ago, she repeated. It doesn't matter now. But it did. It mattered to Tun. Because something about this woman, her presence, her eyes, her silence, made him feel like she wasn't just another maid. She was someone important. Someone connected to him in ways he had yet to understand. A growing suspicion. That night, Tun couldn't sleep. He lay in bed beside Ada, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. Something about Mama Beezy was familiar. Too familiar. He thought back to his childhood, to distant memories buried under years of success and wealth. He had been raised in privilege, but there had been a time, long ago, when things had been different. When he was a boy, his father had been just a struggling businessman. His mother had worked tirelessly to help the family survive. And then, one day, she had disappeared. The memory was blurry, faded by time. But he remembered the night his father had come home with red eyes, sitting him down and telling him that his mother was gone. No explanation. No funeral. Just gone. His father had refused to speak about her again. He had always assumed she had abandoned them, that she had chosen to leave. But now, looking at Mama Beezy, his heart pounded. No, it couldn't be. It was impossible, wasn't it? A confrontation with Ada. The next morning, Tun sat at the breakfast table, his appetite gone. Across from him, Ada sipped her tea gracefully, flipping through a magazine. He watched her carefully. She had hired Mama Beezy. Why? Ada, he said suddenly. She looked up with a smile. Yes, darling. Where did you find Mama Beezy? Ada's expression didn't change, but there was a slight flicker in her eyes. Why do you ask? Just curious, he said, keeping his voice casual. I don't remember you mentioning her before. Ada took another sip of her tea. Oh, she was just one of the many women looking for work. I hired her because she seemed desperate. Old, frail. I figured she wouldn't ask for much. Tun's jaw tightened. She looks familiar, he said slowly. Ada shrugged. Maybe you've seen her around. A lot of these maids look the same, don't they? He didn't respond. But he knew, in that moment, that Ada was lying. And he was going to find out why. Tund couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at the edge of a truth he wasn't ready to face. The more he thought about Mama Beezy, the more restless he became. Who was she, really? Why did she look so familiar? And why had Ada, of all people, hired her? A growing obsession. Over the next few days, Tund found himself watching Mama Beezy even more closely. He didn't mean to, but his eyes followed her wherever she went. She was different from the other maids, not just in age, but in the way she carried herself. There was something in her quiet demeanor that unsettled him. She moved like someone used to hardship, but not like someone who had been born into servitude. She wasn't a maid. Not truly. One evening, as he sat in his study, he pulled out an old photo album. It had been years since he had last opened it. He flipped through the pictures, his childhood, his father's struggling years, the moments before their fortune changed. And then he found it. A faded picture of a woman holding a little boy. She had the same dark eyes, the same quiet strength in her face. His heart pounded. Could it be? The forbidden question. The next morning, Tun made up his mind. He needed answers. He waited until Ada left the house. She had another charity function, one of the many she used to maintain her perfect social image. As soon as she was gone, he walked into the kitchen. Mama Beezy was washing dishes. She didn't notice him at first. She was focused, her hands moving slowly, methodically. But when she finally looked up and saw him standing there, Something flickered in her eyes. Fear. "Good morning, sir," she said, quickly lowering her gaze. Tun didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, watching her. "You don't have to call me sir," he said finally. Mama Beezy hesitated. "It is respectful." Tun took a deep breath. "Where did you say you're from again?" "A small village outside the city," she replied softly. "And you have children?" For a moment, she didn't answer. Then, she nodded. "I did," she whispered. Tun stepped closer. His heart was racing now. "Did you ever lose a son?" Her hands froze. The plate she was holding slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor. Tun's breath caught in his throat. Mama Beezy trembled as she stared at the broken pieces. I'm sorry," she murmured, bending down to pick up the shards. Tun crouched beside her and gently took her hands. "Forget the plate," he said softly. "Answer my question." She slowly lifted her head, and for the first time, she really looked at him. Not as a maid, not as a servant, but as something else. Something deeper. Something unspoken. Tun's throat tightened. "Are you my mother?" he whispered. The room was deathly silent. Then, a single tear slipped down Mama Beezy's cheek. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Tun knew the answer. He had known it all along. The past unraveled. Tun stumbled backward, his mind spinning. This woman, the frail, silent maid who had been living under his roof, was his mother? The same mother he had been told abandoned him as a child? His chest tightened. His whole life, he had believed she was dead or had left him behind. But she was here, working in his house, as a maid. Why? His voice cracked. "Why didn't you tell me?" Mama Beezy's lips trembled. "Because I was afraid," she whispered. "Afraid of what?" Tun demanded. His hands curled into fists. "Afraid of me? Afraid that I would hate you." Her eyes filled with tears. "No, my son," she said softly. "I was afraid of her." Tun stilled. Her? He didn't need to ask who she meant. Ada, his wife. The woman he had loved. The woman who had hired his mother as a servant, knowing exactly who she was. Tun's blood ran cold. Ada knew. She had known all along. And she had hidden the truth from him. A silent betrayal. Tun felt like the walls were closing in on him. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He turned away, his mind racing. How long had Ada known? How long had she kept his mother under her thumb, treating her like nothing? And why? What had she gained from it? Tun looked back at Mama Beezy. She was crying now, her frail shoulders shaking. He wanted to hug her, to comfort her. But more than anything, he wanted answers. He stormed out of the kitchen, his heart pounding with rage. Ada was going to answer for this. She had lied to him. She had betrayed him. And she was going to regret it. Tun could hardly breathe. The walls of his mansion, which once felt like a fortress of comfort and power, now felt like a suffocating prison. His mother, the woman he had believed to be dead or long gone, had been in his home all this time, as a maid. And Ada had known. He clenched his fists as he paced back and forth in his study, waiting for Ada to return. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, betrayal, rage, confusion. How could she do this to him? How could she watch him go years without his mother and never say a word? His phone buzzed. It was Ada. "On my way," her message read. Tun exhaled sharply. Good. Tonight, she would have no place to hide. The calm before the storm. An hour later, the grand doors of the mansion swung open, and Ada strutted in, dressed in a glamorous, shimmering blue gown, a matching designer purse dangling from her wrist. She was beautiful, undeniably so. But to Tun, she had never looked more repulsive. "Darling," she said sweetly, removing her earrings as she walked into the living room. "You're still up? I thought you'd be asleep by now." Tun didn't respond. He just stared at her, his jaw tight. Ada paused. Her perfectly arched eyebrows lifted slightly. "Why are you looking at me like that?" Still, he said nothing. She sighed dramatically, tossing her purse onto the couch. "What is it this time, Tun? Work stress? You know I always tell you to take it easy." That was it. Tun let out a bitter laugh. "Work stress," he repeated. "That's what you think this is about." Ada tilted her head, her carefully composed expression beginning to crack. "Tun, what's going on?" He took a step closer. "You tell me, Ada? Because I would really love to know why the woman working in my house as a maid is actually my mother." Silence. For a split second, the room was so quiet that Tun could hear the faint ticking of the antique clock on the wall. Ada's face barely changed. Barely. But Tun saw it, the flash of something in her eyes. Shock. No. She wasn't surprised that he knew. She was surprised that it had taken him this long to find out. He shook his head in disbelief. You knew, didn't you? Ada let out a slow breath and folded her arms across her chest. Tund, you're overreacting. Overreacting. His voice rose, filled with disbelief. Are you seriously standing there, acting like this isn't a big deal? Ada's expression hardened. And what would you have done if you had known the truth earlier? She took a step closer, her voice low, sharp. Would you have thrown away everything we've built over a woman who abandoned you? Tund froze. Abandoned. That word. The word his father had drilled into his head when he was younger. Your mother left us, son. She didn't want this life. She didn't want you. He had believed it for so long. But now, looking at Ada, the way she had twisted it so easily, he wasn't so sure anymore. Truths and lies. I don't believe you, Tund said, his voice cold. Not anymore. Ada let out a short laugh. Oh, Tund, please. Do you think that woman has been sitting here, waiting for you all these years out of love? She came back because she has nothing. She's nothing. Tund's hands clenched at his sides. You disgust me, he said through gritted teeth. Ada's eyes darkened. And you're a fool if you think she's innocent. Tund had had enough. He turned away from her, his mind spinning. He needed air. He needed space. He needed to talk to Mama Beezy, to hear her side of the story. But before he could take another step, Ada's voice stopped him cold. If you walk out that door, Tund, she said, her voice eerily calm, you'll regret it. Tund turned slowly, his blood boiling. Are you threatening me? Ada smirked. No, darling. I'm warning you. Be careful what truths you dig up. Some things are better left buried. Tund stared at her, heart pounding. Ada knew something. Something she was afraid he would find out. And now, more than ever, he was determined to uncover it. Tund stormed out of the living room, his mind racing. Ada's words echoed in his head. Be careful what truths you dig up. Some things are better left buried. What was she hiding? And why had she gone to such lengths to keep his mother away from him? The air outside was thick and humid. The city skyline shimmered in the distance, its towering buildings a testament to his success. Yet, standing there on his grand balcony, he felt hollow. For years, he had believed his mother was gone. For years, he had accepted the narrative that she had abandoned him. But now, everything was shifting, and the foundation of his world was cracking beneath his feet. He had to find her, not as a nameless maid working in his house, but as his mother. The late-night search. Tund didn't bother to take his car. He needed to walk, to clear his head. His feet carried him instinctively toward the servants' quarters, a smaller building on the far side of the estate. It was modest, too modest for a house as grand as his. He had never paid much attention to how the staff lived. Until now. As he approached, he saw a single dim light glowing from inside. The door was slightly ajar. His pulse quickened. He stepped inside. The small room smelled of lavender soap and something warm, like freshly boiled herbs. A single bed, neatly made. A wooden stool beside it. And there, in the corner, sitting with her back slightly bent, was Mama Beezy. His mother. She was sewing. The flickering light above her cast shadows over her aged face, lines of hardship etched into her features. But her hands, steady, precise, moved like they had done this 1,000 times before. Tund swallowed hard. He had imagined this moment so many times, but now that he was here, words failed him. Mama. Her hands froze. Slowly, she lifted her head, her dark eyes locking onto his. A moment passed, a heartbeat, an eternity, before she spoke. You finally found me. A mother's story. Tund pulled the wooden stool and sat across from her, his heart pounding. I don't know what to believe anymore, he admitted. I was told you abandoned me, that you left me and never looked back. Mama Beezy sighed, her fingers tightening around the fabric in her lap. That's what they told you. Tund nodded. My father, Ada, they all made me believe you didn't want me. A bitter smile played on her lips. And you believed them. His throat tightened. I didn't have a reason not to. Silence filled the air. Then, in a voice tinged with pain, she spoke. Tund, I never left you. I was taken from you. His heart clenched. What? Mama Beezy looked down, her fingers tracing the fabric. Your father was a powerful man, Tund. But he was also a cruel one. He wanted perfection, a flawless image. And I didn't fit that image. Tund leaned forward, hanging on to every word. He was ashamed of me, she continued. Ashamed of my background. I wasn't born into wealth. I was just a village girl who happened to fall in love with a man from a world I didn't belong to. Tund clenched his fists. He had never known his father well. The man had been distant, controlling, always obsessed with his reputation. But to do something like this. One night, Mama Beezy said, her voice barely above a whisper, he gave me a choice. Leave and never see you again, or watch him destroy me completely. Tund's breath hitched. He felt sick. You were just a baby, Tund, she said, tears welling in her eyes. I fought. I begged. But in the end, he had all the power. And I had nothing. Tund's whole body trembled. His father had done this. He had stolen his mother from him and fed him lies for years. And Ada had known. That's why she had kept Mama Beezy hidden. That's why she had treated her like a nobody. Because she was afraid of the truth coming out. Tund stood abruptly, his chest rising and falling with fury. I should have known, he muttered. Ada, my father, they lied to me all these years. And I let them. Mama Beezy reached out, her calloused hand covering his. It wasn't your fault, my son. But he barely heard her. He was already thinking of what he had to do next. Ada had played with fire. Now, it was time for her to face the consequences. Tund barely slept that night. After his conversation with Mama Beezy, he had walked back to the mansion in a daze, his mind a storm of emotions. Anger, betrayal, guilt. He sat in his private study, the room dimly lit by a single lamp. The walls, lined with bookshelves and expensive art, suddenly felt oppressive. For years, he had believed his father's version of events. For years, he had trusted Ada blindly. Now, he saw everything for what it was. A house built on lies. He ran a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. He needed proof, something to confirm Mama Beezy's words. Not because he doubted her, but because he wanted to see the truth with his own eyes. And he knew exactly where to start. The hidden files. Tund had never been one to snoop through Ada's things. But tonight, there was no room for honor. The master bedroom was dark when he entered. Ada was already asleep, her body curled beneath the silk sheets, her breathing slow and steady. He moved quietly to the large oak dresser on her side of the room. The top drawer contained jewelry, perfumes, and expensive makeup, nothing useful. The second drawer, however, was locked. His pulse quickened. Ada was a woman who prided herself on organization, but she rarely locked anything in their room. What was she hiding? Tund glanced over his shoulder. She was still asleep. Carefully, he pulled a pin from one of her earrings and inserted it into the lock. It took a few tries, but eventually, he heard the faint click. He opened the drawer. Inside, a folder sat neatly on top of a few other documents. It was labeled in bold letters, confidential. Tund's hands shook as he flipped it open. And then he saw it. The truth in black and white. Inside the folder were old letters. Legal documents. Bank transactions. The first letter he pulled out was a handwritten note, slightly faded with age. Ada, we need to keep things under control. If Tund ever finds out, everything we've built will come crashing down. Beezy is no longer a problem. She knows what's at stake. But we can't let him get too curious. Do what you must to keep her beneath him. There was no signature. But Tund knew his father's handwriting. A sickening realization settled in his stomach. Ada had been involved in this for years. Even after his father's death, she had continued his work, keeping Mama Beezy hidden, ensuring she was treated like a nobody, making sure Tund never questioned the past. He flipped through the bank statements. There were regular transactions made to an unknown account, payments sent every few months. Blood money, hush money, to keep his mother silent. His heart pounded in his chest. Ada stirred slightly in bed, shifting in her sleep. Tund clenched the papers in his hands. He wanted to shake her awake, to demand answers, to make her admit to everything. But not yet. No, he wanted her to feel the same shock and betrayal he had felt. She had spent years hiding the truth from him. Now, he would expose her. The breaking point. The next morning, Tund acted as if nothing had changed. He sat at the dining table, sipping his coffee while Ada scrolled through her phone. The large windows overlooked the vast estate, the morning sun casting a golden glow across the room. Ada, as always, looked perfect, her silk robe draped over her shoulders, her nails freshly painted. She was the picture of wealth and elegance. But to Tund, she had never looked more like a stranger. You're quiet this morning, Ada said, setting down her phone. Something wrong? Tund smiled. Actually, I was just thinking, we should have a family dinner tonight. Her eyes flickered with surprise. A family dinner? Yes, he said smoothly. Just a small gathering. You, me, and Mama Beezy. Ada's hand stiffened around her coffee cup. For the first time, she hesitated. Why on earth would we have dinner with the help? She said, forcing a laugh. That's absurd, Tund. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Is it? Ada's smile faltered. Tund let the silence stretch between them, watching as a flicker of nervousness crept into her expression. He had her right where he wanted her. The storm to come. By the time evening arrived, the mansion was buzzing with quiet tension. The dining room was set for three, the long mahogany table gleaming under the chandelier's light. Mama Beezy stood near the entrance, her hands folded in front of her, looking unsure. Tund gestured for her to sit. You belong here, he said gently. She hesitated, then nodded, taking a seat at the far end. Ada entered a few minutes later, her usual confidence forced and brittle. She looked at Mama Beezy, then at Tund. Shall we eat? She said coolly, taking her seat. Tund picked up his fork, but he didn't take a bite. Instead, he set down the stack of papers he had found in the drawer. Ada's breath hitched. What is this? She asked, her voice sharp. Tund leaned back in his chair. I think you know. The color drained from Ada's face. Mama Beezy looked between them, confused. Ada, Tund said, his voice deadly calm. Tell me the truth. Did you know she was my mother all along? Ada remained silent. His patience snapped. Tell me. Mama Beezy flinched at the intensity of his voice. Ada swallowed hard, then slowly, deliberately, placed her fork down. Her eyes met his. Cold. Calculated. And if I did, she said, her lips curling into a smirk. Tund's chest rose and fell with barely contained rage. Mama Beezy gasped. You knew? Ada tilted her head, her mask of sweetness slipping away entirely. Of course I knew, she said. I knew from the beginning. Tund's fists clenched. And you kept her hidden from me? Ada let out a soft chuckle. Hidden? She glanced at Mama Beezy with mock sympathy. Darling, she wasn't hidden. She was right under your nose the whole time. It's not my fault you never paid attention. Tund's jaw tightened. You're a monster. Ada arched an eyebrow. No, Tund. I'm a woman who protected what was mine. His stomach twisted. What was yours? You mean my life? My family. Ada smiled. Everything you are today is because of the choices your father and I made. You're successful because you didn't have distractions. You think you would have built an empire if you were busy crying over your mother? Tund slammed his fist on the table. She was never a distraction, he roared. She's my mother. Ada's smile didn't falter. But she's also a maid. Silence. A sharp, deafening silence that made the air feel thick with tension. Mama Beezy sat frozen, tears brimming in her eyes. Tund felt something inside him crack. It was in that moment he realized. Ada had never seen his mother as a threat. She had seen her as insignificant. As nothing. And that was her biggest mistake. Because now, Tund was done playing her game. Now, it was his turn to make her pay. The dining room was heavy with silence. Tund's chest rose and fell, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts. He had expected Ada to deny it, to feign innocence, to at least pretend she wasn't the villain he had begun to see her as. But she had done the opposite. She had confirmed it without hesitation, without an ounce of remorse. Mama Beezy sat still, her hands trembling slightly as she stared at the table, refusing to look at either of them. It was as if she had suddenly shrunk, as if the weight of the truth was pressing down on her, suffocating her. Tund turned his gaze back to Ada, his fingers digging into the table's polished wood. You disgust me. Ada laughed softly, shaking her head as she picked up her wine glass. Tund, don't be dramatic. You act as if I did something horrible. She took a slow sip, her red lipstick leaving a faint stain on the rim. I simply protected our home, our reputation. You needed structure. You needed discipline. Tund clenched his jaw so hard it ached. You call stealing my mother from me discipline? Ada sighed, placing the glass down with a delicate clink. You're so emotional right now. You always had a soft spot for the weak, and that's not a good quality for a leader, Tund. Mama Beezy flinched slightly at the word weak, but she still said nothing. Tund exhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay calm. He had to be careful. Ada was playing mind games, twisting the narrative in a way that made her the reasonable one. She was testing him, waiting for him to explode so she could use it against him. But he wouldn't give her that satisfaction. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. Tell me, Ada, he said, his voice eerily calm. How long did you plan to keep this a secret? How long were you going to keep my mother working as a maid under this roof while pretending she was a nobody? Ada gave him a small, cold smile. For as long as I could. Mama Beezy inhaled sharply, and for the first time since the conversation started, she spoke. Why? Her voice was barely above a whisper, hoarse with unshed tears. Ada didn't even look at her. Because you were irrelevant. A stunned silence filled the room. Tun's hands curled into fists, but before he could speak, Mama Beezy did something unexpected. She laughed. It was soft, shaky, almost sad. But it was a laugh nonetheless. Ada's eyes narrowed. What's funny? Mama Beezy finally lifted her head, and when she did, there was something unreadable in her expression. It wasn't anger or hurt. It was something far more dangerous. Pity. You're a fool, Ada, she said quietly. Tun's eyes widened slightly. He had never heard Mama Beezy speak this way before. Ada stiffened, her grip on the wine glass tightening. Excuse me. Mama Beezy shook her head. You think because you wear diamonds and live in this house, you have one? That because you kept my son from me, you have some kind of power? She let out a soft sigh. Poor girl. Ada's jaw clenched. Watch how you speak to me. But Mama Beezy wasn't finished. You married into a family that never truly belonged to you. You manipulated a man who is now seeing through you. You built your world on lies, Ada. She gave her a sad smile. And do you know what happens to lies? Ada said nothing. They always unravel, Mama Beezy whispered. Ada's lips parted slightly, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. Tund watched the exchange in silence, his mind racing. For so long, he had seen his mother as fragile, as someone who needed to be protected. But in this moment, she looked more powerful than ever. Ada, on the other hand, was beginning to look small. But then, just as quickly as the uncertainty had appeared, Ada shook it off. She leaned forward, her cold smirk returning. You're just an old woman who will never be anything more than a maid, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. Tund slammed his hand on the table, making both women jump. Enough, he said, his voice low and deadly. Ada turned to him, batting her lashes. Darling. Don't darling me, he snapped. You played your games for years, Ada. But this, he gestured around them. This is over. Ada stared at him, and for a brief second, real panic flickered in her eyes. What do you mean? Tund stood up, towering over the table. His voice was calm, but his words were like steel. You are no longer my wife. A stunned silence filled the room. Ada's entire body went rigid. What? You heard me, Tund said, straightening his suit jacket. I want you out of this house by tomorrow morning. Ada blinked rapidly as if trying to process his words. You're divorcing me? Tund didn't answer immediately. He simply looked at her, really looked at her. For the first time in years, he saw Ada not as his wife, not as the perfect woman he once thought she was, but as a stranger. A cunning, heartless stranger. So when he finally spoke, his voice was devoid of emotion. Yes. Ada let out a shaky laugh. You can't be serious. Tund took a step closer. Oh, but I am. You need me, she hissed, her mask of calm slipping. Do you think people will respect you without me by your side? Do you think the media won't eat this story up? She scoffed. Billionaire leaves wife for maid sympathy? Tund smirked. If you think I care about public opinion, then you've underestimated me. Ada opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked at Mama Beezy, then back at Tund. For the first time, she seemed at a loss for words. And that was when Tund knew. He had won. But this wasn't the end. Not yet. Because something told him Ada wasn't going to leave quietly. The next morning, the mansion felt different. It was as if the walls themselves had absorbed the tension from the night before, holding on to it like an unspoken secret. Tund barely slept. He had spent most of the night in his study, replaying the confrontation over and over in his mind. His decision to divorce Ada had been swift, but the consequences were only beginning. Now, as the early morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows, he stood in the grand foyer, his hands in his pockets, waiting. Ada was still in their bedroom. Or rather, his bedroom now. She hadn't come downstairs for breakfast. She hadn't stormed into his study to beg, to scream, to threaten. And that worried him. Ada was many things, but silent was never one of them. His mother, Mama Beezy, walked into the foyer, her steps slow but steady. She had changed out of her maid's uniform, now wearing a simple yet elegant traditional dress, the deep purple fabric complementing her dark skin. Her presence carried a quiet dignity, one that had been hidden for too long. "You look troubled," she observed. Tun sighed, rubbing his temples. "She hasn't said a word since last night." Mama Beezy nodded knowingly. "That woman is planning something." Tund looked at her sharply. "You think so?" She gave him a look that said, "You're a billionaire, but you still have a lot to learn." "Of course she is," she said. "Women like Ada don't accept defeat easily." "She will not walk away quietly." Tund exhaled slowly, glancing toward the grand staircase. He could feel it, the storm brewing. And then, as if summoned by his thoughts, she appeared. Ada descended the staircase like a queen, making her final stand. She wore an expensive silk robe, the fabric clinging to her curves as she moved. Her makeup was flawless, her diamond earrings glinting under the morning light. She looked as regal as ever, but there was something different in her eyes. A cold determination. Tun's jaw tightened. Mama Beezy stepped back slightly, watching in silence. Ada reached the bottom of the stairs and met Tun's gaze head-on. "So that's it then?" she said, her voice cool. "You've made your decision?" Tun nodded. "I have." Ada tilted her head slightly, studying him. "And you really think you can just throw me out of this house like some common woman?" Tun's eyes darkened. "This house belongs to me, Ada, not you." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Ah, Tund," she murmured, stepping closer. "You're so naive." Mama Beezy tensed beside him, as if sensing the shift in Ada's demeanor. Tun didn't move. "What are you trying to say?" Ada let out a soft, almost pitying sigh. "Do you think I married you without securing myself? You may be powerful, darling, but don't forget who I am." Tun narrowed his eyes. "And who are you exactly?" Ada's smile widened. "The future." Tun's pulse quickened, but he kept his face neutral. "Speak clearly, Ada. No riddles." Ada tapped her manicured nails against her robe, as if considering her next words carefully. Then she leaned in slightly and whispered, "Check your accounts." Tun's entire body went still. His accounts? Without another word, Ada turned and walked past them, heading toward the sitting room. Her confidence was chilling, as if she had already won. Tund pulled out his phone immediately. He logged into his banking app, his heart pounding. His personal account was intact. His investments were fine. But when he checked the company's financials, his breath caught. Millions were missing. Not a few thousand. Not even a few 100,000. Millions. Mama Beezy must have noticed the change in his expression because she whispered, "Tund, what is it?" He clenched his jaw. "She's been stealing from me." Mama Beezy gasped. Tun's fingers tightened around his phone as he scrolled through the transactions, his mind racing. Ada had slowly been draining funds from his business accounts for months. Years, even. And he hadn't noticed. A low chuckle filled the air. Ada. She was sitting gracefully on the couch, one leg crossed over the other, watching him like a cat who had just cornered a mouse. You finally see it, don't you?" she said, tilting her head. "You were always so trusting, Tund. So easy to manipulate." Tund's fists clenched. "How dare you?" Ada took a sip of the tea that had been brought in by one of the house staff, one of the few maids who still liked her. "Dare?" she repeated mockingly. "Tund, darling, I did what any smart woman would do. I secured myself." Tund took a step toward her. "Give me back my money." Ada smirked. "Or what?" The silence that followed was thick with tension. Mama Beezy stepped forward. "You ungrateful witch," she hissed, surprising both of them. "After everything my son gave you, asterisk. Everything he gave me." Asterisk, Ada interrupted, her expression hardening. "Do you have any idea what I sacrificed to be here? Do you think I enjoyed playing the perfect wife? Smiling for the cameras? Attending those dreadful charity events?" She scoffed. "I built my reputation alongside Tun's, and I refuse to leave empty-handed." Tund was done. "You're not getting a kobo from me, Ada." Ada's smirk faltered for a brief second before she recovered. "Oh, Tund," she murmured, setting her tea down. "You really don't understand, do you?" Tund's stomach tightened. "Understand what?" Ada stood up, stepping closer until there was barely any space between them. She lowered her voice to a whisper. "You can divorce me if you want. You can throw me out. But if you try to take everything from me..." She leaned in, her lips almost brushing his ear. "I will ruin you." A chill ran down Tun's spine. Mama Beezy sucked in a breath. her hands gripping the fabric of her dress. Tund pulled back slightly, locking eyes with Ada. Are you threatening me? Ada chuckled softly. No, darling, she said. I'm promising you. Tund exhaled slowly, his mind racing. Ada wasn't bluffing. She knew things. She had connections. And clearly, she had been planning for this moment long before he had even suspected her. The battle lines had been drawn. This wasn't just a divorce anymore. This was war. The mansion felt colder than usual, despite the warm city air pressing against the tall windows. Silence stretched through the vast halls, thick and suffocating. The battle lines had been drawn, and Tund knew there was no going back. He had built his empire from the ground up, clawed his way through the ruthless business world with sweat, intelligence, and determination. Yet, in the very home he had built, he was standing across from a woman who had slowly, methodically, been dismantling it right under his nose. Ada, his wife. Or rather, the enemy in disguise. She had stolen millions. She had been deceiving him for years. But the worst part? She wasn't afraid. She wasn't ashamed. She was proud. Tund clenched his fists as he stared at her, his pulse hammering in his ears. What exactly do you think you're going to do, Ada? He asked, his voice low, steady. Ada smirked, her arms crossing over her silk robe as she studied him like a predator observing its prey. That depends on you, darling, she replied smoothly. You could make this easy for both of us. Let me walk away with my dignity, and what I deserve. Tund scoffed. What you deserve. He took a step forward, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. You deserve nothing. Everything you have came from me. Ada's smirk didn't waver. If anything, it deepened. Oh, sweet Tund, she murmured, shaking her head. Still so naive. She turned gracefully and walked toward the bar in the corner of the sitting room, pouring herself a glass of wine. She lifted it to her lips, taking a slow sip before continuing. Do you really think this is just about money? Tund's eyes darkened. Explain. She twirled the glass between her fingers. Power, my dear husband. Control. She turned back to face him, her eyes gleaming with something dangerous. I have worked too hard to be reduced to just the billionaire's ex-wife. I refuse to become another forgotten socialite with a divorce settlement and nothing else. I built my reputation alongside yours. I made myself a force in this city. You think you can just erase me? Tund exhaled sharply, trying to control the storm of emotions brewing inside him. This marriage is over, Ada. You can keep your reputation, but you will return my money. Ada chuckled. Our money, she corrected, taking another sip of her wine. Tund's hands clenched. Don't play games with me, Ada. Ada tilted her head, studying him as if he were a child who didn't understand the rules of the world. Then, with slow precision, she set her glass down and walked toward him until she was close enough for him to see the confidence burning in her eyes. Let me ask you something, she said, her voice dropping into a whisper. What do you really know about me, Tund? His jaw tightened. I know enough. Ada smiled. Do you? A silence stretched between them. Then, she reached into the pocket of her robe and pulled out her phone. With a few taps, she turned the screen toward him. Tund's breath hitched. It was a bank transfer. A large one. From his company's account. To an unknown offshore account. And the date? Just a week before their argument. His stomach twisted. You didn't just take my money, he said, his voice dangerously low. You moved it somewhere I can't trace easily. Ada shrugged, tucking her phone away. Like I said, darling, I prepared for this. A heavy silence filled the air. Tund's mind was racing, calculating his next move. He could take legal action, but Ada was too smart. She had covered her tracks. He could threaten her, but she clearly wasn't intimidated. And then there was Mama Beezy, standing quietly in the corner, watching everything unfold. Tund turned to his mother, seeking wisdom, guidance, anything that would help him make sense of this situation. Mama Beezy stepped forward, her face calm, but her eyes sharp. Ada, she said softly, yet there was steel in her tone. You have forgotten one thing. Ada arched a brow, amused. And what is that, Mama Beezy? Mama Beezy smiled. No matter how much money you steal, no matter how much power you think you have, a thief will always be a thief. Ada's smirk wavered for the first time. Tund saw it, the brief flicker of unease in her eyes. His mother's words had struck a nerve. Be careful, Ada, Mama Beezy continued, stepping even closer. Because the same people who smile at you now, the ones who praise you, The ones who call you Madam Ada. They will turn against you the moment your secrets start to unravel. Ada straightened, forcing the smirk back onto her face. You underestimate me, she said. Mama Beezy shook her head. You overestimate yourself. Tund inhaled deeply, gathering himself. He turned back to Ada, his voice steady. I will give you one last chance, he said. Return my money, walk away, and I will let this go quietly. Ada's lips curled into a smile, but her eyes remained cold. Let this go quietly, she echoed, stepping closer. Then, in a whisper only he could hear, she added, I don't think you understand, my love. I am only just getting started. Tund's blood ran cold. She wasn't just planning to leave with money. She was planning to destroy him. His business, his reputation, his entire empire. This wasn't just betrayal. This was war. Tund Iamide had faced many battles in his life. Boardroom wars, business rivalries, lawsuits, and betrayals from supposed friends. But nothing had ever felt as personal as the war brewing in his own home. He stood there, staring at Ada, his wife, his enemy. The woman who had walked into his life with grace and charm. The woman he had built a life with, now standing before him with defiance in her eyes. And she had just declared war. Tund exhaled slowly, his mind calculating his next move. He had spent years at the top, learning how to play the game of power. He knew men who had lost everything because they underestimated their opponents. He would not be one of them. He straightened, adjusting his suit as he stared at Ada. You think you can destroy me, he said, his voice calm, measured. But you forget, Ada, I am not just some weak businessman you can manipulate. Ada chuckled, her red-painted lips curling into a smile. Oh, Tund, she said, stepping closer, her silk robe flowing like water. I don't think I can destroy you. I know I can. She leaned in, her breath warm against his skin. And the best part, she whispered. You taught me how to do it. Tund clenched his jaw. She was right. Over the years, he had molded Ada into the perfect society woman. Poised, elegant, respected. But in doing so, he had also armed her with knowledge, power, and connections. And now, she was using it all against him. His mother, Mama Beezy, stood in the corner, watching. Her eyes, deep with wisdom, flickered with an emotion Tund couldn't quite place. But she said nothing. Not yet. Ada took a step back, folding her arms. Here's what's going to happen, darling, she said smoothly. I am not walking away empty-handed. You will settle with me generously, or I will take everything, your money, your company, your reputation. Tund let out a low, humorless laugh. And how exactly do you plan to do that? Ada smirked. Oh, Tund, you have no idea the things I know about you. A cold silence filled the room. Tund's mind raced. What did she know? His businesses were airtight, he had ensured that. But still, there was always something, some tiny crack in the walls of power that could be exploited. Shall I remind you? Ada purred. She picked up her phone and tapped the screen. A few moments later, Tund's own phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out and looked at the message. His heart stopped. It was an email from an anonymous source. The subject line read, The truth about Tund Iamide. His hands felt ice cold as he opened the email. Attached was a file, a detailed financial report, and within that report, a mistake. A small, seemingly insignificant mistake in one of his companies, a transaction that had gone unnoticed. But in the hands of the right people, or the wrong people, it could be twisted into something dangerous, something illegal. Tund's eyes lifted slowly to meet Ada's. She smiled sweetly. Now do you understand? A slow rage built in his chest. You would blackmail me? Ada tilted her head. Blackmail is such an ugly word, she mused. I prefer to call it leverage. Tund's fingers tightened around his phone. You think I will let you get away with this? Ada chuckled softly. I think you don't have a choice, darling. A silence stretched between them. Then, a voice broke through. Enough. Mama Beezy. Her voice was not loud, but it carried weight. Authority. Power. Both Tund and Ada turned to look at her. The old woman stepped forward, her frail hands clasped in front of her. She moved with slow, deliberate steps, her gaze locked onto Ada's. My son is not a perfect man, Mama Beezy said softly, but neither are you, Ada. Ada arched a brow. Oh, and what do you know about me, old woman? Mama Beezy smiled. A slow, knowing smile. More than you think. A flicker of something. Fear crossed Ada's face for the first time. Mama Beezy turned to Tund. My son, she said gently, do not play this game with her. Let her go, but do it your way. Tund frowned. My way? Mama Beezy nodded. She wants war. Do not fight it on her terms. Fight it on yours. Ada scoffed. Oh, please. This is not some fairy tale where the wise old woman has all the answers. She turned back to Tund. You have 24 hours to decide, my love. Either we settle this quietly, or I take you down with me. She turned and walked out of the room, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Tund stood there, his heart pounding, his mind racing. Mama Beezy reached out and touched his arm. Do you trust me, my son? Tund looked into his mother's eyes. Then he exhaled. Yes. The city of Lagos Heights never truly slept. It thrived at night just as it did during the day. Cars honking impatiently, high-rise buildings glowing with artificial lights, the streets alive with hurried footsteps and whispered deals. It was a city built on power, money, and deception. And at that moment, Tund Iamide realized that deception had seeped into his own home, poisoning everything he had built. As he stood in his dimly lit study, the email from Ada still open on his phone, his mind raced. How did she find this? Who helped her? How long has she been planning this? A sharp knock on the door pulled him out of his thoughts. He didn't need to ask. He knew who it was. Come in. The door creaked open, and Mama Beezy stepped inside, her frame small but commanding. There was something regal about the way she carried herself, despite being just a maid in this mansion. But she was more than that. She was his mother. Tund locked eyes with her, the weight of their unspoken bond hanging between them. She has you cornered, Mama Beezy said simply, walking over to the window. She parted the curtains slightly, staring out at the vast estate, the towering gates, the manicured lawns, land that Tund had earned with sweat and blood. I know, Tund muttered, running a hand through his hair. He wasn't a man who panicked easily, but this situation was unlike any he had ever faced. Ada wasn't just any opponent. She was a woman scorned, and a woman scorned was dangerous. Mama Beezy turned back to face him. And yet, you still have the advantage. Tund let out a short, humorless laugh. Do I? Because from where I stand, she has all the leverage. He tossed his phone onto the desk. She has dirt on me, and if she leaks it, it could destroy everything. Mama Beezy sighed. She walked over to the desk, her aged hands brushing against the wooden surface. Tund, she said quietly, you are afraid because you believe that she knows your greatest weakness. Tund frowned. She does. If that document goes public. Mama Beezy raised a hand, silencing him. That is not your greatest weakness. Silence. Tund looked at her, confused. Then what is? Mama Beezy stepped closer, lowering her voice. She thinks you have no heart, but I know my son. And I know your greatest weakness has always been your trust. Tund's brows furrowed. Mama Beezy continued. Ada's mistake is that she assumes she is the only one playing a game. She thinks you are too straightforward, too proud, too ruthless to have secrets of your own. Tund's lips parted slightly. Secrets of my own? Mama Beezy's eyes twinkled. She underestimates you. Tund sat down slowly in his leather chair, staring at his mother. He had always believed in winning with power, with money, with influence. But this was different. This was war fought not with weapons, but with knowledge. And knowledge was something he had in abundance. He leaned forward, rubbing his chin. You're saying I need to find out what she doesn't want me to know. Mama Beezy nodded. Exactly. A woman like Ada? She has skeletons. And once we find them, she won't have the courage to pull that trigger. Tund exhaled. For the first time since the confrontation, a flicker of hope stirred inside him. If Ada had spent months digging into his past, that meant she had also been careful to cover her own tracks. But no one was perfect. There was always something. Tund reached for his phone and made a call. The line rang twice before a gruff voice answered. Oga Iamide. Long time. Tund's lips curled slightly. Kola, I need your help. Kola was a fixer. The kind of man who could find out anything about anyone. A ghost in the world of secrets. There was a brief pause. Then, who's the target? Tund's gaze hardened. Ada. There was a low whistle on the other end. Your wife? Oga, this one go hardo. I don't care, Tund said sharply. I need to know everything. Who she talks to. Where she goes when I'm not around. Any money she has hidden. Any affairs. Any weaknesses. No stone unturned. Kola was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Give me 48 hours." Tund hung up. Mama Beezy was watching him, her expression unreadable. "You ready to fight?" she asked. Tund exhaled. "I have to." Mama Beezy nodded approvingly. "Good. Because this war is not just about you." Tund's chest tightened. "What do you mean?" Mama Beezy's expression darkened. "Ada didn't just threaten you, my son. She threatened me." Tund stiffened. That night, as the city of Lagos Heights continued its restless hum, a new battle had begun. And this time, Tund wasn't playing by Ada's rules. He was rewriting the game. The city of Lagos Heights was a beast of its own, thriving on power, deception, and secrets. But Tund Iamide knew that the most dangerous wars were not fought in boardrooms or courtrooms. They were fought in the shadows, in whispered conversations, in the quiet movements of those who thought no one was watching. And tonight, he was about to step into that war. He sat in the back of his black, bulletproof Range Rover, the tinted windows concealing him from the outside world. The streets were alive, hawkers weaving between cars, neon lights flashing from towering buildings, the air thick with the scent of roasted suya and burning fuel. But inside the car, silence reigned. Next to him, Kola, his trusted fixer, scrolled through his tablet, the blue glow illuminating his sharp, calculating face. "I found something," Kola finally said. Tund's fingers curled around the leather seat. "Talk." Kola turned the tablet toward him. On the screen was a blurred image of Ada, stepping out of a sleek black sedan in front of an upscale hotel. But it wasn't the location that caught Tund's attention. It was the man standing beside her. Ao Duramola. Tund's jaw clenched. Ao was more than just a business rival. He was an enemy. A smooth-talking, calculating snake who had spent years trying to undermine Tund's empire. But why was Ada meeting with him in secret? "She's been seeing him for months," Kola continued. "Discreet meetings. No paper trails. No phone records. But they're careful. Too careful." Tund's mind raced. If Ada was plotting something with Ao, this wasn't just about a broken marriage. It was warfare. "She's playing me," Tund muttered. "She's been playing me this whole time." Kola smirked. "Oga, I hate to say it, but your wife is good. Real good. She covers her tracks better than a politician." Tund exhaled slowly. "Not good enough." He studied the image. The way Ada leaned in slightly toward Ao. The subtle way his hand hovered near her lower back. The small, almost imperceptible smirk on her lips. This wasn't just a casual business meeting. This was something personal. A dangerous calm settled over Tund. He had built his empire from nothing. He had fought against corporate sharks, corrupt officials, and ruthless competitors. If Ada thought she could betray him and walk away unscathed, she was mistaken. "What else did you find?" Tund asked, his voice like steel. Kola swiped to another image. This time, it was a bank transaction. A large sum of money transferred to a private offshore account. Not just any account. One under Ada's name. Tund's heartbeat slowed. "She's been siphoning money," Kola confirmed. "Not a lot at once. Just small amounts. But over the past year, it adds up." Tund let out a bitter laugh. "How much?" Kola met his gaze. 500 million naira. Silence. The weight of betrayal pressed down on Tund's chest, but he didn't let it show. Ada had stolen from him, and she had used that money to fund something. Or someone. Tund leaned back in his seat, his mind calculating. "She's planning to leave me." Kola nodded. "And she wants to ruin you before she does." A slow smirk spread across Tund's lips. "She thinks she's ahead of me." Kola chuckled. "She thinks you're still in love with her." Tund's smirk vanished. Love? Love had died the moment he saw the way Ada treated the people beneath her. The moment he discovered the truth about Mama Beezy. The truth that Ada had known and hidden from him. And now, with this new betrayal, there was only one thing left between them. War. Tund straightened his tie. "Does she know you're tracking her?" Kola shook his head. "No. But someone is helping her. A professional. Maybe a private investigator. Maybe a lawyer. She's covering her tracks too well for an amateur." Tund exhaled. He had underestimated Ada. But he wouldn't make that mistake again. He turned to Kola. "Get me more. I want everything. Every phone call, every meeting, every single transaction. If she sneezes, I want to know before she does." Kola grinned. "Oga, consider it done." Tund looked out the window. The city stretched before him, full of life, full of power struggles. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about survival. Ada had made her move. Now it was his turn. and he never lost. Tund Iamide sat in the back of his armored Range Rover, his mind churning like a stormy sea. The city lights of Lagos Heights flashed past as his driver maneuvered through the late-night traffic. His chest felt tight, not with fear, but with something colder, something more calculating, determination. His wife, Ada, had crossed a line. It wasn't just about the secret meetings with Ao Duramola. It wasn't just about the stolen 500 million naira. It was the audacity of her deception, the sheer boldness of it. She had played him, smiled in his face, laid beside him at night, pretended to be the perfect wife, all while plotting his downfall. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that Tund Iamide was always 10 steps ahead. Tonight, he was going to prove it. The setup. Boss, she's at the hotel. Cola's voice crackled through the Bluetooth speaker in the car. Tund took a slow breath. Who's with her? Ao. Tund's lips pressed into a thin line. He expected that. Anybody else? Cola hesitated. A man. Early 50s, heavily built. I ran a facial scan. He's a private investigator. Retired police. Worked on some high-profile cases in Abuja before moving into private security. Tund let out a quiet chuckle. His wife had hired an investigator. She wasn't just leaving. She was gathering ammunition. She wanted dirt on him. She wanted leverage. Smart, Ada, but not smart enough. Tund's grip on his phone tightened. Keep watching. Don't interfere. What if she's planning to run tonight? Cola asked. She won't, Tund said smoothly. Not yet. Not until she thinks she is everything she needs. And that was her mistake. She thought she was in control. The revelation. 30 minutes later, Tund stepped out of his car and into the grand lobby of the Royal Orchid Hotel. The hotel was one of the most expensive in the city, reserved for the elite, the kind of place where secrets were bought and sold over expensive whiskey. He strode through the marble-floored lobby, his expensive Italian shoes clicking softly against the ground. He had no intention of sneaking. Let them know he was coming. Let them panic. At the reception, the young woman behind the counter stiffened when she saw him. Mr. Iamide, she greeted nervously. Tund gave her a polite nod. Room number. The receptionist swallowed. Sir, I can't disclose. Tund slid a black business card across the counter. She glanced at it, and whatever she saw there made her face pale. With shaky hands, she scribbled a number on a small piece of paper and passed it to him. Thank you, Tund said, pocketing it. He turned and walked toward the elevator, his steps slow, deliberate. The tension in his body was electric, but outwardly, he remained the picture of composed power. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and as he stepped inside, he pulled out his phone and dialed. Cola. Yes, boss. I want you to record everything. There was a pause. Then Cola chuckled. Oga, this one goes sweet. Tund smirked as the elevator doors closed. The confrontation. The hallway on the 15th floor was silent, the plush carpet swallowing the sound of his footsteps. Tund stopped in front of the door. Room 1507. He knocked once. Twice. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. Then he heard whispers. Movement. Someone inside hesitated before slowly unlocking the door. The moment the door cracked open, Tund shoved it wide and stepped in. Ada stood in the middle of the room, wearing a silk robe, her expression frozen between shock and anger. Beside her, Ao Duramola stood stiffly, his jaw clenched. And in the far corner, the private investigator, a heavy-set man with a lined face, watched with wary eyes. Tund took his time, scanning the room, letting the tension grow. Ada was the first to speak. What the hell are you doing here? She demanded, her voice sharp. Tund tilted his head, his gaze locking onto hers. Funny. I was about to ask you the same thing. Ada folded her arms. Don't act like you don't know what's happening, Tund. I'm done with this marriage. Tund arched a brow. Is that so? Yes, she spat. I'm sick of playing your trophy wife. I'm sick of pretending. You think your money makes you untouchable? You think I don't know the dirty things you've done? Tund chuckled. So this is what this is about. A smear campaign. Ada's lips curled into a smirk. Call it what you want. But when I leave, I'm not leaving empty-handed. You owe me. Tund exhaled slowly, nodding. I see. Ao stepped forward, his voice smooth. Tund, let's be civil about this. There's no need for threats. Ada just wants what she deserves. Tund turned his sharp gaze on him. And you? What do you want? Ao's smirk didn't waver. I'm just helping a friend. Tun's laugh was cold. A friend? That's funny, because the last time I checked, friends don't screw another man's wife and plot to steal his money. The room froze. Ada flinched. Ao's smirk twitched. The investigator shifted uneasily. Tun smiled. Oh, you thought I didn't know? You thought you were being discreet. He leaned forward slightly. I see everything. I know everything. And I promise you, Ada, you're going to regret thinking you could outplay me. Ada lifted her chin. And what are you going to do? Kill me. Tun laughed. Kill you? He shook his head. No, Ada. I don't need to. You've already destroyed yourself. With a casual flick of his wrist, he pulled his phone from his pocket and pressed play. The room was instantly filled with Ada's voice, a recording from one of her secret meetings. Tund is too arrogant. He thinks I'm just a dumb trophy wife. But when I leave, I'm taking everything. He'll be ruined, and I'll be free. Ao cursed under his breath. The investigator's face turned grim. And Ada? Her entire face drained of color. Tund stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. Now, you listen to me, Ada? I don't lose. You thought you could outsmart me, but the truth is, you've already lost. Ada's lip trembled. For the first time, there was no confidence in her eyes. Only fear. Tun smirked. Game over. The air in room 1507 was thick with tension, so thick it felt like a rope tightening around Ada's throat. The walls of her carefully constructed lie were collapsing around her. Tun stood there, calm, composed, like a king delivering judgment, while Ada, his once beloved, once untouchable wife, felt small for the first time in her life. Ao shifted uncomfortably beside her. The private investigator, a man Ada had paid handsomely, looked like he was rethinking his contract. And for good reason. Tun had just played his cards, and he had played them brilliantly. The recording he had just played, her own words, spoken in secrecy, now thrown back at her, was a noose tightening around her neck. Ada felt her heartbeat pounding against her ribs. She had to think. She had to move fast. She squared her shoulders and tried to summon the cold, calculating woman she had always been. What do you want, Tund? She asked, her voice steady, despite the storm raging inside her. Tund chuckled. Slow, deep, and dangerous. Oh, Ada. He took a step forward, towering over her. You still don't get it, do you? He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. It's not about what I want. It's about what you've already lost. Ada flinched, but she wasn't about to break, not yet. She lifted her chin, crossing her arms. What are you going to do, Tund? Ruin me? Drag me through the mud? Please, she scoffed. You're a public figure. If this gets out, you think people won't ask how your own wife managed to betray you under your nose? Tund smiled. That damn smile. The one that always made her feel like a fool, like a piece on his chessboard. Ah. He nodded slowly. So that's the game you want to play? He turned slightly, walking toward the minibar, pouring himself a drink as if this conversation wasn't shattering her entire world. You know, Ada, he continued, swirling the whiskey in his glass, you always thought you were the smartest person in the room. He took a sip, then turned, his eyes locking onto hers with quiet intensity. But the thing about playing with fire is that you only realize you're burning when it's too late. Ada's pulse quickened. She was losing control of the conversation. She could feel it slipping through her fingers like grains of sand. Ao suddenly cleared his throat, stepping forward. Tund, he said, attempting to sound calm. Let's not escalate things. We can talk this out like adults. Tund arched a brow at him. Talk, he repeated. You mean like how you've been sneaking around with my wife? Plotting behind my back? Trying to steal from me? Ao stiffened. It's not like that. Tund chuckled. Cold. Amused. It's exactly like that, he corrected. Then, just as calmly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, black USB drive. He held it up, letting the dim hotel lights glint off its surface. Ada's breath hitched. She had a terrible feeling about what was on that drive. Tund tossed it onto the coffee table. Everything, he said smoothly. Every call. Every secret meeting. Every transaction. Every moment you thought you were being clever. Ao swallowed. Ada felt sick. Tund tilted his head. Tell me, Ada, how do you think the press will react when they find out Nigeria's beloved billionaire's wife has been stealing from him? Silence. He let his words sink in, let the weight of them press against her chest. For the first time in her life, Ada didn't have a comeback. She had always prided herself on being in control, But now, she wasn't holding the knife anymore. Tund was, and he was pressing it right against her throat. The power shift. Tund exhaled slowly, then moved to sit on the plush hotel couch, crossing one leg over the other. Now, he said, his voice smooth as silk, I'm going to give you two choices. He held up a finger. One, he said, you disappear. Quietly. No money, no assets, no dignity. I'll have the lawyers draft the divorce papers, and you'll walk away with nothing but the clothes on your back. Ada's stomach dropped. Or, Tund continued, holding up a second finger, I take this evidence, send it to every media house in the country, and watch your reputation crumble in front of the whole world. The room froze. Ao let out a breath. Tund, come on. Shut up. The words were so calm, so deadly, that even Ao, a man who prided himself on always talking his way out of things, knew better than to push. Tund turned back to Ada, his expression completely unreadable. The choice is yours, darling. Ada's hands curled into fists. She had lost. Completely. She wanted to scream, to fight, to hurt him the way he had just hurt her, but deep down, she knew. This was checkmate. She had no leverage left. Tund had taken everything. Her voice, when it finally came, was small, defeated. What do you want me to do? Tund smiled. That's the spirit, he said, setting his drink down. He reached into his suit jacket, pulled out a folded document, and placed it on the table. Ada's heart dropped when she recognized it. Divorce papers. Already signed. Already notarized. Her entire life, everything she had built with him, was now just a piece of paper waiting for her signature. Tund tapped it lightly. Sign it, he said. Pack your things. Get out of my house. Ada's hands trembled as she picked up the pen. The ink felt heavy as she scrawled her name. With one signature, she was no longer Mrs. Ada Iamide. She had fallen from her throne. She had lost everything. And Tund, he had just won the ultimate war. The ink had barely dried on the divorce papers when the reality of her situation began to sink in. Ada Iamide, once the envy of every woman in Lagos, once the queen of the Iamide Empire, was now nothing. She sat there, her hands still gripping the pen, her nails pressing into her palm, so hard they almost drew blood. Tund stood up, slow and deliberate, watching her with the same detached interest one might give to a fallen chess piece. He had won, and he knew it. But Ada? She wasn't ready to accept defeat. Not yet. The walls of the hotel suite felt smaller, suffocating her. Her mind raced for a way, any way, to regain control. She had spent years crafting her image, maneuvering herself into the life of luxury and power. She had played the perfect wife, built the perfect facade, learned exactly how to smile in public while holding a dagger behind her back. And now, in one night, it had all been ripped away. Tund picked up the divorce papers, scanned them, then folded them neatly and tucked them into his suit jacket. Without looking at her, he said, You have 24 hours to pack your things and leave my house. Ada flinched. My house. Not our house. Not your house. Just his. The word stung. She wanted to throw something at him, to scream, to remind him that she had built that house with him, that she had stood by him through everything. But she knew that argument meant nothing now. Not when the man standing before her had already erased her from his life. The ghosts of her past. Tund walked to the door, his every movement calm and controlled, like a man who had anticipated this outcome for a long time. He turned the doorknob, but just before stepping out, he paused. And then, without facing her, he said the words that shattered what little pride she had left. You were never a queen, Ada. You were just a placeholder. The door clicked shut behind him. Ada sat there, paralyzed. It took her a full minute to process what had just happened. And then, slowly, the reality of it all crashed down on her. She had lost. Tund was gone. Her position? Gone. Her status? Gone. Everything she had spent her entire life working for had slipped through her fingers like sand. For the first time in years, Ada was truly alone. The sound of Ao shifting beside her brought her back to the present. He had been watching everything unfold, his face unreadable, but now, he stepped forward, rubbing a hand over his face. Well, he muttered, that could have gone better. Ada turned to him slowly, her eyes burning with rage. This is your fault. Ao sighed. Oh, please. You were the one who got caught. What was I supposed to do? Warn you that your husband is smarter than you gave him credit for. Ada gritted her teeth. She wanted to slap him. She had thought she had control over everything. Her marriage, her secrets, even Ao himself. But it turned out, she had been outplayed on every front. Ao ran a hand through his hair and leaned against the table. Well, he said after a long pause, what now? Ada took a deep breath. She couldn't afford to fall apart. Not yet. Her hands clenched into fists. She might have lost this round, but the game? The game wasn't over. The last thread of hope. Ada stood up abruptly, her mind racing. There was still one card left to play. One secret that even Tun didn't know about. And if she played it right, she just might be able to turn everything around. But to do that, she needed to move fast. She turned to Ao, her voice sharp as a blade. Give me a lawyer. Ao raised a brow. For what? You already signed the divorce papers. Ada's lips curled into a cold smile. Yes, she said. But Tun forgot one very important thing. Ao crossed his arms. And what's that? Ada's eyes gleamed with dark satisfaction. The prenuptial agreement. Ao's brows furrowed. What about it? Ada took a step forward. Tun thinks he's rid of me, she said softly. But he has no idea that he just walked into my trap. Ao watched her carefully, sensing a shift in her demeanor. You have a plan, he said. Ada smiled. Oh, I always have a plan. She reached for her phone and dialed a number. As the call connected, she took a deep breath and prepared for war. Because if Tun thought this was over, he was dead wrong. Ada had always known that power wasn't just about money. It was about control, influence, information, and she had spent years collecting secrets, studying people, understanding their weaknesses. Tun Diamide may have won the first battle, but he had underestimated one thing, her ability to strike back. She sat in front of her massive vanity mirror, her reflection illuminated by the golden glow of the city lights streaming in through the penthouse window. This was not how it was supposed to go. She was supposed to be untouchable. She was supposed to be the woman every man feared and every woman envied. And now, she was a discarded wife, thrown away like yesterday's trash. Ada exhaled slowly, rolling her shoulders back. No, this wasn't the end. She reached for her phone and dialed a number. The line rang once, twice. Then a deep, familiar voice answered. Ada. She smirked. Hello, Barrister Idawu. The man chuckled. I was wondering when you'd call. News travels fast. Ada leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs. I'm sure it does. There was a pause. Tund is making moves, Ada? He wants to cut you off completely. Ada let out a small laugh. Let him try. Barrister Idawu sighed. Look, if you're hoping to drag this out in court, you need to be prepared. He has some of the best lawyers in the country. The prenup was airtight. No, Ada cut him off. It wasn't. A sharp silence filled the line. Explain, Idawu said, his tone suddenly more alert. Ada's fingers traced the rim of the champagne glass beside her. Tund never read the fine print, she murmured. I made sure of it. Idawu was quiet for a moment. Then, you hit a clause? Ada smiled. Not hit. Let's just say, he was so confident he'd never need a way out that he signed without looking at the smaller details. Idawu let out a low whistle. What are we talking about here? Ada's eyes gleamed as she whispered, 50%. Another pause. 50% of everything? Idawu asked, disbelief in his voice. Ada leaned forward, her fingers tightening around the phone. Yes, she said, her voice smooth like silk. Tund was so focused on protecting his pre-marriage assets that he forgot to guard his future empire. According to that document, if he ever divorced me, I walk away with half of everything he built after we got married. And that was billions. Idawu was silent, digesting the information. Are you sure he doesn't know? Ada smirked. If he did, do you think he would have been so quick to throw me away? She could practically hear the lawyer grinning on the other end. This, he said, is about to get very interesting. The web of deception. The next morning, Ada made her move. She arrived at the Iamide estate with a calm expression, dressed in a sleek navy blue designer dress, her hair pinned back in a sharp, elegant style. It was her house, after all, at least for now. The security guards hesitated at first, but, knowing better than to challenge her, let her in. As she stepped inside, the familiar scent of vanilla candles and expensive cologne filled her nostrils. This was her kingdom. She wouldn't let anyone take it from her. She heard footsteps approaching. Then, Ada. Tund's voice was firm, his eyes cold as he stepped into the grand hallway. What are you doing here? Ada smiled sweetly. We need to talk. There's nothing to talk about. Oh, but there is. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder. Tun's expression didn't change, but she saw his jaw tighten slightly. What is that? He asked. Ada took a step closer, her heels clicking against the marble floor. This, she said, tapping the folder, is a little gift from our past. It's the prenup you signed. Tun's eyes darkened. I already gave you your settlement. What more do you want? Ada chuckled. Oh, sweetheart, you don't understand, do you? She held up the document. You didn't just give me a settlement. You gave me half of your empire. A tense silence filled the air. Tun's fingers curled into fists. What are you talking about? Ada opened the folder and flipped to a specific page, then turned it toward him. Right here, she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. Section 4, Clause 8. In the event of a divorce, the undersigned party, Tund Iamide, agrees to an equal division of all wealth and business assets acquired during the duration of the marriage. She took a deep breath, savoring the shock in his expression. That means, darling, I'm entitled to half of everything you built after we got married. Tun's jaw ticked. Ada leaned in slightly, her voice soft but lethal. Now, she said, we can either do this the easy way, or I can take this to court. But I assure you, she placed a hand on his chest, patting it gently. This will be very messy if you try to fight me. Tun stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he exhaled, his nostrils flaring. You really think you've won, don't you? He murmured. Ada smiled. I know I have. Tund was silent for a long moment. Then, without warning, he laughed. Ada frowned slightly. What's so funny? Tund shook his head, amusement flickering in his eyes. You were always smart, Ada. I'll give you that. He stepped forward, closing the space between them. But you forgot something. Ada's fingers clenched around the folder. Tund leaned in, his voice low and dangerous. You're not the only one who plays dirty. Ada felt a sudden chill run down her spine. And then, before she could react, Tund reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With a single swipe, he played an audio recording. Ada's blood froze. It was her voice, recorded from months ago. A conversation she barely remembered, one where she had boasted to Ao about manipulating Tund into signing the prenup without reading it carefully. The evidence was right there. Her own words, twisted into a weapon against her. Tund smirked, watching as the color drained from her face. You thought you trapped me? He whispered. I trapped you. Ada took a step back, her breath shaky. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't part of the plan. Tund tucked his phone away and stepped past her, his voice cool and calm. I suggest you pack your things, Ada, he said over his shoulder. Because after today, he glanced back at her, his gaze sharp. You won't have a single kobo of my money. Ada's hands shook as she gripped the folder. For the first time, she felt fear. Ada's hands trembled as she clutched the folder, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the expensive leather cover. Tund had turned the game against her. She had walked into this mansion with confidence, armed with a weapon that was supposed to secure her victory. But now, as she stared at Tund's retreating back, she felt the walls closing in on her. How had he recorded her? When? The realization settled in her stomach like a heavy stone. He had been planning this. Watching. Waiting. She inhaled sharply and forced herself to regain control. No, this wasn't over. Ada Iamide didn't lose. She had spent years mastering the art of deception, years learning how to turn the tides in her favor. She wasn't about to be outplayed by the man she had once controlled. Not now. Not ever. The last attempt. Taking a deep breath, she straightened her shoulders and followed him down the long hallway, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Tund, she called, her voice calm, almost gentle. He didn't stop. I know you're angry, but can we talk about this? She pressed, walking faster to keep up with his long strides. Tund chuckled, a dark, humorless sound. Talk. He finally stopped at the entrance of his study and turned to face her. His face was unreadable, but his eyes burned with a cold fury. Oh, now you want to talk? Ada tilted her head, feigning confusion. Darling, let's not make this ugly. I don't. The sharpness of his voice made her flinch. Tund stepped closer, his towering presence almost suffocating. You don't get to stand there and pretend you didn't plan this from the start, he said. His voice was controlled, but she could hear the restrained rage beneath it. Ada swallowed. I only did what was necessary. Tun scoffed. Necessary? You manipulated me. You tricked me into signing a contract that would rob me of everything I built. Ada lifted her chin. Everything you built? Funny, because last I checked, I was there every step of the way. I stood by you. I smiled at the right people. I made sure we were seen as the perfect couple. Do you think you would have risen to the top without me? Tund let out a slow breath, as if reining in his emotions. That's where you're wrong, Ada, he said. You didn't build with me. You built a prison around me. You controlled my life, my home, my decisions. I was protecting us, Ada interjected, stepping closer. Tun's jaw clenched. No, he said, his voice quieter now, but no less lethal. You were protecting yourself. And now that it's falling apart, you're desperate. Ada hated that he saw through her. She hated that for the first time, she wasn't the one in control. She reached out to touch his arm. Tund. He took a step back. And that single movement, the way he recoiled from her touch, felt like a slap across her face. He used to adore her touch. He used to look at her like she was his entire world. Now, all she saw in his eyes was contempt. Ada swallowed down the bitterness rising in her throat. She couldn't lose. Not like this. She had one last card to play. The final lie. Slowly, she softened her expression. If you do this, she whispered, if you really take this to court, you'll ruin me. Tun didn't respond. You may think you're winning, but have you considered what this will do to your reputation? She asked, tilting her head slightly. A messy, public divorce? The media will tear us apart. Do you really want to be the billionaire who humiliated his wife? Tun's gaze darkened. She knew she had struck a nerve. She took another step closer. Darling, let's be smart about this, she purred. We don't have to fight. I'll walk away quietly, with no drama. All I ask is for a fair settlement. We don't have to make this ugly. Tun stared at her for a long moment. Then, ever so slowly, he shook his head. Ada, he said, his voice laced with disappointment. You really think I don't know you? Her heartbeat quickened. You don't want peace, he continued. You want leverage. You want to find a way to trap me again. Ada parted her lips, searching for something, anything, to say. But Tun was already turning away. And this time, she knew she couldn't stop him. The final blow. Just as he reached for the door, he paused. Oh, he said, glancing over his shoulder. One more thing. Ada held her breath. Tund pulled out another folder and tossed it onto the table between them. What's this? She asked warily. A real contract, Tund said. Not the one you manipulated me into signing. Ada's hands clenched into fists. Tund smirked. Did you really think I wouldn't have a backup plan? He mused. Ada opened the folder. The words on the first page made her entire body go cold. It was a counter lawsuit. A lawsuit that claimed she had committed fraud by tricking him into signing the prenup under false pretenses. And the best part? It included evidence. The recording of her conversation with AO, emails she had sent to her lawyer, even text messages where she had hinted at her plan to trap Tund financially. Ada's vision blurred. If this lawsuit went public, it wouldn't just ruin her financially. It would destroy her reputation. She would become a national disgrace. Tund, she whispered. But he had already reached the door. His voice was calm, final. You should leave, Ada, he said. Before I have security throw you out. The words hit her like a slap. Ada Iamide, the woman who once ruled this mansion, was being discarded like trash. As she stood there, frozen in place, she realized something. For the first time in her life, she had lost. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind Ada, the sound echoing through the vast, empty hallway. She stood motionless, her breath shallow, her mind racing. For the first time in years, she had no plan, no strategy, no lifeline. She had always believed that no matter how bad things got, she could talk her way out, manipulate the situation, charm her way back into power. But this time, Tund had won. Her legs felt weak as she took a shaky step forward. The pristine marble floors that once gleamed under her expensive heels now felt foreign, almost hostile. This was her home, or at least it had been. Now, she was nothing more than a stranger in it. The walk of shame. As she descended the grand staircase, she could feel the silent stares of the household staff. The maids, the butlers, the security guards. They knew. They all knew what had happened. They didn't speak. They didn't smirk. They didn't laugh, at least, not openly. But their eyes screamed the truth. The queen has fallen. Ada squared her shoulders. lifting her chin as she walked toward the entrance. She wouldn't cower. She wouldn't let them see her break. She was still Ada Iamide, wasn't she? A powerful, elegant woman. A woman who knew her worth. But as she passed by Blessing and Rose, the two maids who had first whispered about her cruelty, she saw something in their eyes she hadn't expected. It wasn't just relief. It was pity. And that was the final blow. Ada had spent years looking down on them, treating them as insignificant. And now, they pitied her? Her fingers curled into fists. This wasn't over. Not yet. The exit. The front door opened, and the cold night air hit her face. A black car was already waiting outside. It wasn't the luxury Bentley she was used to. It was her car, the one she had arrived in when she first married Tund. The one she hadn't driven in years because she had insisted on riding in Tund's convoy. A small, almost insulting reminder of where she had started. Her suitcases were already in the trunk, packed neatly by the staff she had once ruled over. It was a quiet, humiliating departure. No media, no cameras, no one begging her to stay. Just her and the cold realization that she had lost everything. The driver didn't say a word as he opened the door for her. Ada hesitated for a moment, her pride screaming at her to turn back, to find one last way to fix this. But deep down, she knew there was nothing left to fix. She slid into the back seat, her movements slow, measured. As the car pulled away from the mansion, she forced herself to look straight ahead. She wouldn't look back. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her regret. But in the pit of her stomach, she felt it. The first taste of true failure. And it was bitter. The lonely night. Ada had nowhere to go. Her parents had disowned her years ago when she had chosen Tund over them. Her so-called friends were nothing more than social climbers who would abandon her the moment they heard the news. And her savings? She had access to some money, but nothing compared to the wealth she had grown used to. For years, she had laughed at women who depended on their husbands, thinking herself smarter than them. Yet here she was, powerless, homeless, and alone. The driver pulled up to a luxury apartment complex, the one she had secretly rented months ago, thinking she might need an escape someday. She had never imagined she'd actually have to use it. As she stepped out of the car, the weight of reality finally crashed down on her. She was no longer Ada Iamide, the billionaire's wife. She was just Ada. And for the first time in her life, she was terrified. The next move. Inside the apartment, Ada sat in the dimly lit living room, staring at the glass of wine in her hands. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. She hesitated before opening it. "You're out. Now it's time to talk. Call me when you're ready." She frowned. Who the hell was this? She started to type a reply, but then she noticed something. Another message. This one was a picture. And when she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. It was a photo of Tund's mother, the poor old maid she had spent years mistreating. But this time, she wasn't in her maid uniform. She was sitting in a grand office, behind a desk, dressed in powerful, elegant clothes. And beside her, a man, a rival billionaire, someone who had been waiting years for a chance to bring Tund down. Ada's fingers trembled as she gripped her phone. This wasn't just a photo. It was a warning. And suddenly, she realized. She might have lost the battle, but the war had just begun. The apartment was cold, but Ada barely noticed. The phone in her hand felt heavier than it should have. Her eyes locked on the picture of Tund's mother, the woman she had mistreated for years, now sitting confidently behind a grand office desk. Ada's heart pounded in her chest. How was this possible? For years, she had seen the old woman as nothing, a frail, weak maid with no power. She had insulted her, humiliated her, treated her like dirt under her feet. But now, it seemed she had grossly underestimated the woman. Ada gritted her teeth, her fingers tightening around her phone. "You're out. Now it's time to talk. Call me when you're ready." The message from the unknown number was still there, staring back at her, taunting her. Her mind raced. Was this a trick? A warning? Or an opportunity? Ada had spent years navigating the ruthless world of wealth and power. She knew one thing for sure. Nothing happened by accident. Whoever had sent this message wanted something from her. And that meant she wasn't completely finished. Not yet. A new alliance? Ada poured herself another glass of wine, her fingers tapping against the table as she thought. Who was behind this? And why now? She had no doubt that the woman in the picture, Tund's mother, had orchestrated this entire thing. But why reveal herself now? Ada smirked bitterly. Revenge. The old woman must have been waiting for the perfect moment to strike, waiting for Ada to be weak, waiting for her to lose everything. And now, she was showing Ada just how powerful she truly was. Ada exhaled sharply. She had two choices. She could ignore the message, pretend she hadn't seen it, and accept defeat. Or she could fight back. Ada had never been the type to roll over and accept failure. If this was a game, then she would play. She took a deep breath and dialed the number. The call was answered on the second ring. A deep, steady voice spoke. "I was wondering when you'd call." Ada didn't bother with small talk. "Who are you?" A low chuckle. "Someone who knows you're not as powerless as you think." Ada narrowed her eyes. "And what do you want?" Silence. Then, "Meet me tomorrow. 10 a.m. Skylight Hotel. Private suite." The call ended. Ada stared at her phone, her mind racing. Whoever this was, they were confident, powerful, and dangerous. But so was she, and she had nothing left to lose. The next morning, Ada arrived at Skylight Hotel dressed in all black, a sharp blazer, fitted trousers, and high heels that clicked against the marble floors with authority. She was no longer the humiliated wife who had been kicked out of her home. She was Ada Iamide, the woman who had built her way to the top once. And she would do it again. The receptionist guided her to the private suite on the top floor. The moment she stepped inside, she saw him. A man in his early 50s, dressed in a sleek gray suit, sipping coffee like he had all the time in the world. His presence screamed wealth and influence. Ada recognized him instantly. Mr. Domenico Quara, a billionaire in his own right, and Tun's biggest rival. Ada folded her arms. "So it's you." He smiled. "Did you think your husband was the only man who could control Lagos?" Ada didn't sit. "What do you want?" Dominic set his coffee down. "I want what you want, Ada." She arched a brow. "And what's that?" He leaned forward, his voice smooth. "To bring Tund Iamide to his knees." A thrill shot through Ada's spine. She had spent years living under Tund's shadow, loving him, hating him, being used by him. Now, she had a chance to turn the tables, to destroy him. But could she trust Dominic? And more importantly, what price would she have to pay? To be continued.